Thank you so much for your words on your book, as well as your work on minimizing existential risk. I think we're now going to open it up to the audience and try to take as many questions from the floor so that everyone has an opportunity to put their questions to you. So if you'd like to ask a question, you could raise your hand up high so that our steward can see that. And if you could also wait until you've got a microphone and only speak once you have, because this event is being recorded and we have no way of knowing what you've said if you don't have the microphone. So with that in mind, could we take the first question? Gentleman with the long hair, front row.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. I was quite interested in the 1 in 6 figure for emerging existential risks this century. Specifically, I know that's quite different from what a bunch of other people, even in the effective altruism movement, believe. So I was curious, what are the biggest things that cause you to have a different opinion on that than, say, William MacAskill?
I think,
what are the crucial considerations here?
Sure. Should I answer straight?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that my estimate ultimately is all that different from various others. Lord Martin Rees of Cambridge asked this kind of question in his book, Our Final Century, about a decade ago. And he was actually asking a slightly different question about what's the chance that there'd be something that led to the global collapse of civilization, even if that were then recoverable. Whereas I'm looking particularly at existential risks, the risks that by their very nature are not recoverable. But his estimate was 1 in 2. And Nick Bostrom has a similar estimate to mine, and although he avoids giving estimates recently, but if you look back, you can find it. And then some people in the effective altruism community, have estimates that are unfortunately very high, higher than 50%. So I don't, and some have much lower. So I don't think it's all that out of line, but it is fair to say, if you look at the different types of estimates, that we don't really know. This is not a case of estimates all lining up with each other or something like that. It is something that ultimately we will never really know until it's too late. I try in the book, I provide my own best estimates for all of these different risks. And that's something that will probably end up getting me in trouble because a lot of, particularly scientists, are used to not using numbers unless they come out of a rigorous, objective scientific process. And then if it's something where we can't be that sure, they tend to use qualitative terms like unlikely. But there's a really big problem with this. If I simply say that some risks are unlikely, or perhaps extremely unlikely, that sounds like you're dismissing a risk that's extremely unlikely. But I think the problem is that the way we use those terms normally depends upon the stakes as well as upon the probability. If a doctor says to you that you're extremely unlikely to die from this operation, and then you later find out it was a 5% chance, you'd be very unhappy about that. Whereas if someone says it's extremely unlikely to rain tomorrow and it's a 5% chance, then that seems about right. So I wanted, since I'd gone to all of this effort over more than a decade studying this and then writing this book, I felt that it was a real shame if I didn't actually tell people what I thought on reflection with my best guesses for these different risks. So that's kind of where these things come from. And people can reasonably disagree, but this is a sincere effort to estimate these things.
If we take the second question from the gentleman on the left.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about the long period of reflection. What makes you think that we can figure out the best future for humankind in an act of reflection? Because in my very limited understanding, human history has been a story of trial and error, and I guess there are a lot of things that we don't know, so I'm a little bit worried that when we enter this phase of reflection, that it will last forever?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Ultimately, what I was sorry, what I was trying to explain there is, if you imagine humanity as being kind of a coherent agent, we're clearly used to the idea of group agents, and we talk about things such as maybe the Cambridge Union and what it believes about some event, or what its kind of motives are, or its incentives and so forth. And then on larger scales, we'll talk about what's in Britain's interests, or what France believes about this thing. And I think that we can also think of humanity as a group agent too, and quite usefully. And that's something that I encourage in the book. But it is somewhat less coherent even than these other smaller groups, which are more homogeneous. So there are challenges in thinking about this. But I've tried to sketch a kind of idealized view of, well, if humanity had its act together and took these risks seriously, how would it plan things out? And what I tried to say was that ultimately we want to achieve our potential, but before doing that, we need to work out the best of various incompatible ways of going about achieving that. We don't want to, achieving our ultimate long-term potential, perhaps over millions of years, can certainly wait on some shorter period of reflecting on that. And that can also wait upon achieving existential security. So I partly sketch out this kind of future plan in order to set it aside and to say that is not actually the challenge for our generation. What we need to do is achieve this existential security. I think that there may be many things that it takes us a very long time to sort out, and certain kinds of things don't have to wait. So if there are things that involve the best way for people to be living their lives, in their individual lives or in their families or something like that, there's no need for that to wait. But if it's a question of some more major fork in the road, for example, should humanity, when we develop the technologies, should we settle other planets or and travel to other stars? If we were to embark on such a project, then this could easily lead to a splintering of humanity. We're currently at this point where probably a uniquely unified point in human history. In the early 100,000 years of human history, humans were, or Homo sapiens were all in Africa. But we weren't unified, we weren't connected across this vast continent when you're just walking. Then we spread out over the world and became isolated from each other when the land bridges were gone. And then we entered this period of tens of thousands of years of after this human diaspora of kind of going our own ways. And then in the age of exploration, these different groups got linked up again. And now through globalization, we're increasingly interconnected. But there are various ways in the future where we could lose some of that unity, either through settling other planets. We're thinking, hundreds of years in the future here, or from genetic engineering and changing who we are. Some people think that it would be good if there was some kind of liberty, like where parents could choose what kinds of children they had. If we did that for a few hundred years, then again, humanity would probably splinter into various different groups that are very different to each other. And we may lose this kind of moment that we have where we are relatively unified, and we could make some kind of serious choices about our future, and perhaps we'd never be able to be so united again. So they're the examples of kind of really serious big questions about what to do with the entire future, which really, I think, should wait on serious reflection about them. Whereas for other things that don't need to wait, they don't have to wait.
Could take the second question from the lady on my left here at the front.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I noticed that when you talked about emerging threats to humanity, one of the items on your list was AI, which I presume is artificial intelligence. So obviously we do hear a lot about, predictions about how AI will take over humanity, etc. So I was wondering what your take on it is, and precisely what do you think the impact of AI will be in the future on humanity?
Yeah, so there are two emerging existential risks that I'm particularly worried about, which are engineered pandemics and then unaligned artificial intelligence. So in that second category, what I'm concerned about are AI systems which have general intelligence, so sometimes called AGI rather than just AI, artificial general intelligence, and systems of AGI that can act in the world in some ways like humans can, so agents. I think that the easiest way to explain my concern from the top level there is that if you ask the leading AI scientists when that's likely to occur, when will we have systems that can do almost all of the work, the types of intellectual work and jobs that humans have at the moment, their estimates are kind of all over the place. But the median estimate, the typical estimate, is that this would happen in about 50 years. So that it would happen this century. We would reach the ability for AI systems to do all the work that humans can do. And then if you look back to this 200,000-year history of humanity and you ask, why is it that humanity has managed to get to this point where we are actually more or less in control of our destiny, in a sense that chimpanzees are not. Chimpanzees are at the mercy of humanity, for better or worse, as are every other species on the planet. How did we get to this position where we can choose what path we go forward and there's no one else above us choosing over us? And the answer is not to do with our physical abilities, but to do with our mental abilities. So it's partly things that we would class as intelligence, partly things maybe we would class as ability to cooperate or ability to learn and so forth, to communicate. But they're all cognitive abilities. And what has been suggested by these leading AI scientists is that we will reach a point this century with about a 50% chance that we would reach it this century, that we would finally be able to develop systems that exceed us in these ways. And that raises this question about why would it remain us who are calling the shots and are in charge of our destiny. And it's easy to see that if that really were true, if you condition upon developing such systems, that this would be a major transition in human history and a serious question about would we retain control in that position. And I think we probably would. But I'm not sure of that. I can't be 99% sure that we would survive such a transition. That seems kind of crazy, given that we've never seen one before, and we would be giving up the only thing that actually puts us, makes us unique in this regard. And there are groups of scientists who are trying to work on this and trying to work out how to make sure that you could control artificial intelligences that are more intelligent than us, or to align them with human values. And that's why I talk about unaligned AI. So maybe instead of controlling them, you could make it so that what they want is actually the ideal world that we want. And so in building their ideal world, they build ours too. But the scientists who are working on this are finding it very difficult and are not at all sure that they'll be able to actually create these systems to control such advanced AI before the capabilities are there to make that AI in the first place. And things seem to be moving towards it at a unpleasantly quick rate in that regard. So that's not to say that AI is bad. I don't say the risk is artificial intelligence. That's the whole field, including the good things and the bad things. The risk is unaligned artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. And I do think that it's reason to be very cautious as we proceed with AI and to put a lot of effort, perhaps as much effort, into appropriately governing and controlling this technology as into developing it in the first place.
If we could take the next question from the gentleman in the suit in the middle, so third row.
Thanks a lot for your talk, sir. So you mentioned that you fear that humanity would not be able to realize its potential. So in your opinion, can there ever be a definitive standard of when humanity has reached said potential? And if not, at what point can we hang our hats on and say, we've done enough, that's acceptable, and that's okay?
So yeah, in the book, I don't try to definitively describe what our potential is, but I am really motivated by these bright futures that we may be able to create. I think that the potential for humanity is very bright indeed, and that's what motivates me so much to look at these risks. It's not that I want to obsess about risks and things. It's that I think that people neglect how long our future could be. An analogy that I use in the book is that that humanity has been around for 200,000 years. A typical species on Earth survives for about 1 million years. And so if we think of that in terms of a human life, then humanity would be in its adolescence. And this actually fits fairly well. You see a kind of humanity that has just got powerful enough to really get itself in trouble without being wise enough to know what to do with those powers. And if you think about, say, the decision-making on the kind of timescale of an election cycle, a 5-year election cycle would correspond, if you think of this life of humanity, to the next 5 hours in the life of the adolescent. And actually, that does seem to, again, map on pretty well, that often for the sake of the next 5 hours, we risk our entire future. And so this is something where, trying to actually get people to really understand that the future could be so long. And in fact, while 1 million years is typical for a species, it's by no means the maximum. And so, for example, the horseshoe crab has survived for 450 million years. And there's no real reason why, barring existential risk, why humanity couldn't survive for 450 million more years. The Earth will still be habitable at that point. And then there's things that we could do to improve the habitability of the Earth and actually survive much longer again. They're not actually all that different to some of the things being discussed for doing in the next 20 years when it comes to geoengineering. We would just need to be able to avoid 1% of the effects of the brightening sun is what we'd need to do to survive for the next period. So we could have this huge amounts of time, and then it's well known that there are 100 billion stars in our galaxy and billions of reachable galaxies across the cosmos. And I'm not sure if necessarily our potential scales with that number, if there's something there. But it seems strangely parochial if we think it definitely doesn't. That we are kind of like, I kind of worry that we're a bit like kind of drifting, like microbes drifting on a dust mote through a beautiful gallery. And we know that we can see off this dust mote all these amazing rooms and paintings and other things that are available. And we know that they're so much larger than where we are. And yet we kind of then, we have such thoughts occasionally when walking home on a starry night, and then we get home and we go to sleep and just go about our daily business on the dust mote again. And it seems very plausible that in this kind of scale of the cosmos, that some of our potential could be found there as well. And then there's also questions about the quality of our lives. And the quality of life has been, by and large, improving over the last couple of 100 years. There's good evidence on this. The length of our lives has doubled over that period, on average in the world. And there's still suffering in our lives, kind of avoidable pain that we could eliminate from our lives, and injustices in the world that we could get rid of. We've done well to mostly get rid of slavery and various other injustices, but there's still much more we could do. And then that's just a lower bound on the quality of our life, getting rid of the bad things. We could make each of our lives so much better. You can see this because if you think about your peak experiences, those moments in your life which are where everything's coming together, in my case, the rest of my life isn't bad, but I would trade thousands of the kind of more humdrum experiences coming here to Cambridge in the cab this afternoon or something like that for some of these, these peaks. And there's no fundamental reason why we couldn't actually live all of our lives at these peaks. Or maybe have experiences that are even better, that are to these peaks as they are to the typical experience in our lives. And we're just beginning to understand the psychology and the neuroscience behind these things. So I think that there's a whole lot of reasons in terms of time and space and quality where things could be much, much better. So I kind of paint a picture of that at the end of the book, and what we might be able to achieve in these lands beyond the precipice if we get that far.
If we could take the next question from gentleman in the red sweater at the front.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You mentioned in your talk as well that our top priority should be getting to a stage where we have some sort of existential security. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how likely you think it is that we would get to that stage and what that stage would look like. When you talk about the biggest risks we're facing, you highlighted it's always the new ones, the ones that are just emerging. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that in the future that will still very much be the case, that we're responding and kind of catching up to whatever technology is the newest. And in that sense, the precipice is more of a new normal rather than a reflection point, and we'll never be able to get to that mm-hmm. existential security point.
Yeah, so let's see. So I do think that at least so far, new technologies, humanity's had this exponential increases in power, where in 1945, when we developed nuclear weapons, first our power had escalated so high that we're able to threaten ourselves. And our wisdom is lagging seriously behind. No one's claiming that we've had exponential growth in our wisdom. It seems that it's growing falteringly, if at all. And I think that what needs to happen is for our wisdom to catch up. And for us to develop the norms and institutions needed to govern new technologies that could potentially be dangerous from the get-go. And this is a reason why it's important to think about existential risk on the whole, rather than, as has happened, to have a movement around nuclear weapons that was huge. I mean, this was a case where a particular existential risk was, people were marching in the streets. The biggest demonstration ever in America's history at the time was against nuclear weapons along the grounds of trying to safeguard humanity. And then this is happening again with climate change, another existential risk, I think. But in both cases, these demonstrations happened 40 years after we'd known that this thing was a real problem, and these things were happening too late. What we need to do with new such technologies is to have them be appropriately governed right from the start. And I think that we could do this if only it were a global priority. So it could be the case that these risks continue and we don't get our act together, in which case this period that I'm calling the precipice would probably only last a few centuries before it's the end. But I also think that it is possible to get these risks down. If you look at the natural risks, the background of natural risks can be shown to be something like 1 in 10,000 per century chance, such that if we didn't get our act together on that for 100 centuries, we'd still have a 99% chance of making it through that time. We've got some time to get that together and to develop the technologies needed to ensure that we're protected from asteroids and other things. When it comes to the anthropogenic risks, they're ultimately within our control because we could choose to stop threatening ourselves with these things. We could choose to dismantle the nuclear weapons and so on. Now, obviously, it's not that easy. You can't choose to dismantle the nuclear weapons, and I can't choose. Clearly, collectively, we can choose. And we need to kind of own that responsibility collectively and not just say, oh, we're in this really difficult game theoretic situation where, neither of us can back down. We can actually back down and do these things. So we need to be aware of that. And so I think that if this does become a global priority, that I'm fairly hopeful that we could make the appropriate international institutions and laws needed to ensure that new technologies that could pose these risks are appropriately governed from the start, and that we take appropriate steps to ensure that our potential is never seriously threatened again. And what we'd have to do is make it so that this chance of failure is set to a low level and then decreasing every year or every century after that in order to be sustainable. You could think of like a risk budget over time where you say something like the entire kind of like aggregate of all the risk in the future centuries has to be kept below 10%, so that we have to keep adding increasingly small amounts of risk each century. So I do think there's quite a useful sustainability analysis of that. And I am somewhat optimistic that we can do it. I put the chance that humanity ultimately achieves its potential so that we achieve one of the best futures available to us at something like 1 in 2. So I think we really can get there. And that in some sense a lot of the risk comes in this century, because I think that that's about the right kind of time period where enough social change could happen to actually start to take these things seriously and put in place the institutions to stop this.
So I'm quite conscious of time, so we've got time for one more question. So if we could take that final question from gentleman there in the bluish, dark blue top.
Hi. So I was wondering if you think that decelerating technological progress is a worthwhile goal, and if it is, if it's feasible.
So I think yeah. So if humanity was unified, if you imagine that you were playing some strategy game in the role of humanity, I think that it's and your goal really was to achieve the long-term potential. I think it's not that hard, because in that context you wouldn't have this constant temptation to just splurge on the current consumption and so forth. You'd have this kind of patience. And what you could do is invest even more in safety and governance than you're investing in technological rapid change, and could probably make this work. I think this is a case, though, that when one steps back and looks at the less idealized frame, that at least for these nearby technologies, such as biotechnology and artificial intelligence, that it's very hard to slow them down, and that you'd be much better off trying to speed up the safety and governance than to slow down the technological development, and also make far fewer enemies in the process. And so I would strongly recommend that of the very small kind of fraction of talent and resources we have going into caring about these issues and thinking about existential risk, that it be dedicated to effectively improving our wisdom, humanity's ability to not fall into these traps and to govern the technologies appropriately, rather than in slowing things down, which is probably a fool's errand at this stage.
Thank you, first off, to Toby for joining us today for what was a fascinating talk and taking the time to answer so many questions from the audience. I'd like to also take the opportunity to once again thank the Effective Altruism Cambridge community for making this talk happen and collaborating with us as a society. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for what was the final speaker event for this term. It's been an honor to serve as your speakers officer this term, and I hope you've enjoyed the variety and mix of events we've put on. Really do hope that you join us tomorrow for our presidential debate on the significance of the Cambridge Union. That will be our final event of term, so it should be a great event, almost unmissable in my book. Thanks once again for joining us here. As I mentioned at the start, Toby will be sticking around to sign books, and there'll be some books on sale as well outside if you've got cash. So if you're keen on that, do stick around for that. But thanks once again for joining us here, and thank you again, Toby, for joining us today here at the Cambridge Union.
Yep.
Thanks so much. as well.